welcome to the Raising Achievement website and this introductory video on raising achievement, supporting children with learning difficulties and working with at-risk student groups. My name is Tebbutt and I'm a specialist educator. I thought I'd share with you a little about how I came to be in this role. I guess I started out, as many of us did, as a primary or secondary trained teacher, and my career was going along quite nicely until we actually had our second child. And I realised very quickly, probably from about the age of 2, that he was progressing quite differently than other children I had known. I can remember waking up at 7:30 one morning to find he was missing, and you can imagine to my horror, living on a farm, waterways, all the horror scenes that could have occurred. Fortunately, he was found a kilometre away. He'd gone down to the cowshed to visit his father and was brought home safely. At other times, I can remember we used to find him on things like the apex of a roof, very high up, surveying the world, and he seemed to have no fear. And it wasn't long before he went off to kindy, and I can remember his kindy teacher saying to me, "Your son's going to need a good wife." And I remember thinking, what does that mean? Basically, it meant that everywhere he went, he left a trail of destruction behind him, and somebody was going to be required to tidy up after him. It wasn't long before he went off to school, and I can remember within 3 months his first teacher was saying to me, "Look, your boy's just not meeting his early milestones." And I can remember thinking at the time, well, no matter, I'm a good primary trained teacher, and I thought to myself at the time, I'm good at teaching reading, and I prided myself on my CVs and my ability to teach language, and I thought I've just got to get stuck in over the holidays and do some work with him. I did get stuck in and do some work with him over to the holidays, and I found that not much happened. And I remember thinking then, I've got two problems here. One is, how do I help my boy achieve his milestones? And the second is, how do I help myself as a primary trained teacher to better meet the needs of children like my son? And I can remember at the time talking with other teachers, and we all felt similarly, that although we felt we helped the majority of children in our class, there was always a few children who we knew had other difficulties. We had some idea of what their difficulties were, but we knew that with our mainstream teaching methods that we weren't really meeting their needs. The 1-hour video that I want to show is really sharing some of my journey with you. And I want to start by looking at not only why I'm here, but I guess why some of you have chosen to look at this video. And I want to start with some case studies. The first case study is of a young girl that I have known since she was a toddler, and it became apparent quite quickly that she had major learning difficulties with reading, spelling and writing. We tried to give her the support and extra help, but by the age of 13, I can remember her self-esteem was in shreds. And I finally talked her parents into getting a specialist education assessment done. What that specialist education assessment showed was actually astounding. This girl was actually in the top 5% of children academically, so a very intelligent child, but she had severe dyslexia, which made reading and writing extremely difficult. By the age of 13, her self-esteem was in shreds. She couldn't understand how she seemed to have a good brain, but she couldn't do these basic, simple things. She was also one of her twin, and her twin didn't have any difficulties, and you can imagine how difficult this was. She went on to get the right support, and once she got the right support and she worked with getting the help she needed at school, she went on to become head girl of a rather large school. She went off to university, and after her first year at university she was accepted to med school, and she's currently in her 4th year at med school. I have to say, I really wonder how many children like this young lady that we miss in education. And I guess one of the reasons why we're here looking at this video today is because we want to find out more about children like her. The second student, excuse me, the second student I'd like to talk about is a young man that I met at the age of 5 years and 10 months. I can remember his parents brought him to me because they were quite distressed that he'd gone off to school as a bright young button, really keen to go to school, looking forward to it, went off carrying his school bag, but within a few short months he's actually lost his confidence, he'd lost his interest in school, and he was a rather sad boy. Fortunately, the parents knew that there was a history of dyslexia in the family, so they decided to come along and to see if he could be assessed. So we did assess this child. By the time he got assessed, he was actually 6, and again, we actually found that he was extremely intelligent but with dyslexia. The class teacher actually thanked us for the assessment. He ran the gifted program in the school, and he said, I actually felt that this young man was very intelligent, but with all the assessments that we do, I couldn't back up my claims that I felt that he should be in the gifted program. The result of that test was that the child went on to have his difficult areas more supported and an appropriate program put in place, and then his areas of giftedness were also recognised, so his brain could be stimulated and he could move forward. So the outcome for that boy was he got regular achievement gains in his areas of difficulty, but also he got schoolwork that recognised his intelligence. And again, in this primary school situation, I'm sure that you can all identify with children that you have taught that may be in this category. So now that we've actually established, why we are here, I want to talk about the way our education system is structured. And at this point, I would normally have a diagram to show you. But the way that I have actually explained this, because I have felt that in our mainstream approach, there are some aspects that we have missed. Firstly, in any given classroom, wherever you are in the world, whether you've got toddlers or whether you've got older people, you will find that there are some first wave learners. There are people who find learning really easy. They hardly even need a teacher. Our job is just to put resources and learning opportunities in front of them, and they will learn very well. The majority of our children are what we call second wave learners. They need great first practice teaching. They need a lot of the literacy and numeracy initiatives that we put in various countries. All the wonderful programs that we have, different reading programs, support programs, also the support of specialist teachers, and also the use of teacher aides. Now, second wave learners, we would often consider that perhaps they're between maybe 6 months and 2 years below their chronological age, but given all those supports, they will actually reach their chronological age quite easily. I'm actually going to skip third wave learners for the moment, and I'll come back to them, but we also have fourth wave learners. These are the children who are looked after by special education. They often receive specialist funding in most countries, and these children may have gross sensory difficulties like major vision and hearing type problems. They may have physical difficulties, they may have intellectual difficulties, but they come under fourth wave and special education. The group that we've actually missed are what we call third wave learners, and the figures are now showing, the latest figures, that up to 22% of children fall in this category. And these are the children with dyslexia, dyspraxia, children on the autistic spectrum, children with auditory and visual processing disorders, and even also children with ADHD. And although ADHD isn't considered a learning difficulty, many children with ADHD also do have a learning difficulty, and also some of the problems or challenges that ADHD causes requires the same remediation that we would use for third wave learners. And I recently had the opportunity to present at a conference, and I asked at the conference for people to speak in pairs and to talk about their experience in education. Did they feel that there were more than 22% learners in the third wave category? Did they feel that there were less than 22% learners in this category, or did they feel it was about right? I was actually surprised. Quite a few people actually felt that it was more than 22%, and everybody else said that they felt it was about right. Nobody actually suggested that 22% was an overstated figure. Now, this is rather interesting, because if we look at our education system around the world, and I was often taught when I went through training that children with dyslexia, these things were a minority. 22% isn't a minority. And I think as we learn more about education, the more research that comes out about education, brain theory, and that sort of thing, we're learning more that we can actually support this learner group. We're talking about the third wave learners and that 22%. So I think one of the difficulties in our education system is that we have almost missed that there is a third wave learner. In my training, I feel that we have actually always lumped second wave and third wave learners together, and often we see that the children have gone through some of the great programs that we have got in school, like the reading programs, like having additional support, but they are still really underachieving, and that often signifies a third wave learner. Now, today's focus is actually going to be looking at third wave learners and what their needs are. So I want to really reiterate that mainstream teaching does do an effective job of meeting the needs of the majority of students. And I think as educators, sometimes it's very easy to look at the things that perhaps we're not doing so well and not recognise the things that we are doing well. So we do recognise that mainstream teaching meets the needs of the majority, but what about the rest of the students? And we're going to accept that for this presentation that it's at least 20% of a learning population. Now, at this point, I usually like to give people some kind of sense what it feels like to have a learning difference, a learning difficulty, or a learning disability. And I'm going to put a link on the website to a DVD. Now this DVD, it's on a YouTube clip. A young man has made this DVD, a 14-year-old, who wants us to understand what it feels like to have a DVD. Now if you're in a class setting, a staff room setting, and you're watching this DVD, I'd like you to pause this video at this point and have a look at the DVD. Because I really want people to understand what it feels like. And I think for the majority of us, in my seminars, people tell me that this is a really aha moment for them. The second thing that I would actually like to do, and I'm actually going to post on the website, it's actually a reading task. And in this reading task, it actually gets you to feel like what it's like to have a specific learning difficulty. Now you will have heard that children with dyslexia often get their B's and D's mixed up, and in this piece of writing the B's, D's, P's and Q's might be all mixed up and they might say anything. The piece of writing also actually the words kind of move and you read it as two lines. Now I have to say, when you look at this piece of writing, it is a real story and it actually does make sense. And a lot of people are actually shocked as to how, when they try to decode this piece of writing, how difficult it is to do it, how tiring it is, and also the shock is this how difficult it is to be a third wave learner. So I'd like you to do those two exercises and then come back to the DVD. I think the interesting thing too is when we look around the world, there are many people who have succeeded in life, who have dyslexia, who have ADHD and have learning difficulties. We're told about people like Leonardo da Vinci, Thomas Edison, even people like Richard Branson, politicians, Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, a lot of actors, Tom Cruise, Whoopi Goldberg, even Walt Disney and Steve Jobs. And there are many people who've been very successful in life. And I think our role as an educator is how can we support the children who we come in contact with to be on this side of the ledger and be successful and to stay out of the negative statistics. And unfortunately, currently, many of the third wave learners reach all the negative statistics. Often they're overrepresented in things like stand downs, exclusions, expulsions, depending on what terms you use wherever you're from, but excluding children from school. Often they're in the youth justice kind of system. We're told that far too many, there's a greater percentage of people with dyslexia and ADHD in the prison system, and also the use of social services. So how can we as educators help the children that we come in contact with to be on the positive side of the ledger and stay away from those negative statistics? And this is really what this DVD is all about. So the research is actually telling us that instead of teaching for mainstream, we need to teach for diversity. And when we teach for diversity, it takes into account things like children's home backgrounds, individual needs, it takes into account disabilities. It actually cuts across socioeconomic backgrounds. Children who are gifted will be better catered for. Children who are English second language are better catered for. We see a lot in the media about gender differences and differences about boys and girls. And when we teach for diversity, all these things are actually taken into account. The interesting thing, the research is also saying that teaching that is responsive to student diversity has a positive impact on low and high achievers at the same time. And this is very exciting because I can remember when I went to Teachers College, we were told that you can't do special things for people with dyslexia because it's not fair on the others. What we now know is that when we teach in a differentiated way and we meet the needs of third wave learners, everybody benefits. So first and second wave and fourth wave learners will learn very well in this kind of environment. So we want to know who are in the at-risk groups and how do we recognise them. And I think this is one of the challenges that all of us face. And although you can identify children in class that you think have got difficulties and things wrong with them, it's sometimes they don't always come with a diagnosis. Now, when I first started looking into this topic, I was actually given a 25 characteristics sheet, and I still value this sheet. I feel that sometimes it's very easy to slip into academic language, to teacher talk, and what we're really looking at, especially when we're working with teachers and with families who haven't had specialist training, we want everyday language. And this 25 characteristic sheet that I'm going to also put up on our website will give you just that. So I want to go through those characteristics now just to help you understand, and this will help you identify other children in your classes who haven't already got a diagnosis. We usually talk about the children in several categories. I think the real challenge is you can't line up 10 different people with learning disabilities and say this is what they look like. Usually they have these characteristics, often they'll have these characteristics, sometimes they'll have these characteristics, and occasionally they'll have other characteristics. So everybody is a different mix of characteristics, so we're looking to identify those. So usually this is an intelligent child who fails at school, and if you think about some children that you have in your class and you know that they're actually intelligent and yet they aren't doing well at school. Often you think that they speak well in certain situations, but they just don't pass the tests and when written things come about. It's a child who reads on for no or who writes 41 for 14, and they can't remember the sequence of letters which make up a word. This is often where we'll see this in the classroom, children reading things back to front, and it is one of the characteristics. The child who hears a dog barking or the truck honking but doesn't hear what their parents or their teacher has said. And I often hear parents and teachers talk about a child who's got their ears painted on or they've got selective hearing. Whenever I hear somebody talk about a child in this way, I always think, what else is going on for this child, because this is one of the characteristics. The child who loses their homework, who misplaces their book, or who doesn't know what day or month of the year it is. Often these children are actually quite confused and they do lose things and they can never find things. The child with the messy desk, the falling pants, their shoelaces are undone, and also they attract dirt like a magnet. And you could almost, I wouldn't suggest that you did this, but I could almost walk around a playground in a lunch hour and say, I'll have a look at that one, I'll have a look at that one. They have a kind of an appearance about them. The child who doesn't look where they're going, who bumps into doors, who trips over their feet, and who doesn't look at the person who's talking to them. And yes, they are clumsy. It's almost like they have, not as good control of their limbs. The child who calls breakfast lunch and who confuses yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and whose timing is off. And often they have a major difficulty with the sense of time, and even telling the time takes them many more years than others. It's the child who can't tolerate the smallest mistake. They explode at the slightest frustration, they tune out in mid-conversation, and they're happy one moment and they're tearful the next. And I think when we look at some children in the class, they seem to get upset over small things, but they often feel frustrated, and it comes out as a big meltdown, but it's actually a build-up of a number of things. This is the child who's reluctant to try anything new and who's frightened by change. And these children with learning difficulties don't like, for example, they find it very hard on days when they have relievers. They find it very hard when there are different activities, going out on school trips, when they don't know what's expected of them. And we will often get calls at our office on days where children have had relievers. I work for an organisation in New Zealand, Education and Achievement Association, who supports at-risk children in schools. And so often schools will call us, and so will families, and we note regularly that often this happens on days when there are relievers, and perhaps they're not as well understood by those relievers. This is the child who says I don't care or I won't when they really mean I can't. So children would rather be thought of as naughty than thought of as stupid. So they will often behave badly rather than actually sort of say I can't do this, I don't know how to do this. So those things usually present themselves. There are other characteristics which frequently present themselves. For example, this is the child who can't picture things in their mind and who can't visualise or remember what they see. And I always find this one a bit of an anomaly, because we are often told, and it is true, that people with dyslexia have got great 3D brains. They can visualise and they can see things in 3D. Now, one would think that because you can do that you should be able to picture things in your mind and visualise and remember what you see. But the thing is, they actually have difficulties picturing words in their mind. They can often picture images and like when they're making things and see that in 3D, but they can't visualize or remember what they see when it's actually related to words. So there is an anomaly that occurs. Excuse me. This is also the child who bothers nobody in the classroom and who doesn't learn. And there are often, and it's actually girls who sit down the classroom quietly. They never actually cause a fuss, but they're really just not achieving, but they do it very quietly. This is the older child whose language comes out jumbled, who stops and starts in the middle of sentences, and who talks about hopsitals, aminals, and eminies. They get the sequence of their syllables mixed up. And there is 99 times out of 100, there is a kind of a speech pattern or problem that's actually connected to this so that you can hear it. It's the child who hugs the cat too tightly but who can't hold their pencil. They don't feel pain, or they try to wear summer clothes in winter. And you'll often see at schools, it's summer, it's really hot, and children wearing jerseys, and then in winter when everyone else is freezing, they've just got a t-shirt on and no shoes on. And so their sensory system is different. This is also the good swimmer who falls up the stairs. And this is a very interesting one because, again, you'd think if somebody was good at physical activity that they would actually be able to control their limbs. And this is what having specific learning difficulties is about. You can be very good at some things, and other things, even in that same area, you perform poorly at. So it's an unexpected difference in your capabilities. This is also the child who can't keep a friend or who prefers to play with children that are younger themselves. And there is always a social component too that goes with learning difficulties. And many people report all through childhood that having friends and having friends over and keeping friends is a major difficulty, and often that children get on very well with children younger, and even babies. They're great with looking after babies, and they're also good at working with adults, but they actually have trouble with their own peers. This is the child who wants everything done in a certain way, who tells tales, who picks on others for every little thing, and who bosses everyone around. And I guess this is one of the worst challenges of children with learning difficulties, because it's a great way to become unpopular when you sort of tell on people. And the reason that children do this is that they're very well aware that they make a lot of mistakes themselves when they have learning difficulties, and their self-esteem doesn't want them to feel like they're the only one that's actually making mistakes. So they are very quick to point out other people's mistakes, which of course doesn't go down very well, and then they end up with peer, and friendship problems. This is the expert strategist at chess who actually can't understand a riddle or a joke. So here again you've got this child who's very intelligent and is a great strategist, or very academic, but then a basic simple thing they just don't understand. Now sometimes this is the child who's slow to get up, slow to move, but quick to play. Now, this child, I feel sorry for children at this point, because often we feel that it's actually a behaviour thing, that they can do things when they want to, or, they enjoy playing, so they're good at those. So we often sort of think that children perhaps are lazy, when in actual fact this is one of the characteristics of the learning difficulties. And basically, when you are doing work, or you're doing something that you either like or that you're good at, all your neurons fire and things are working, but when you find things difficult, or you can't do things, then nothing seems to work, which is very hard for a child. This is also the child that can add or multiply but not subtract or divide. They can't do maths in their head, but they can do it on paper. So again, you've got those sort of anomalies, that they can do some things but not others, and it's quite confusing. You would think that if a child was at this level of intelligence, they should be able to achieve in every area at that level of intelligence, but you get some up here and some down here. This is the child who skips words or adds them when they're reading aloud. And for many of the children, they have a visual processing problem, and that they add words in or skip them when they're reading. This is the child who smiles at everyone, who greets strangers with open arms, and they also say hello to everyone they meet, and their good nature leads them into trouble as the fall guy. And often I think the easiest way to spot these children in the classroom is whenever you're having a joke, a class joke, these children end up carrying the joke on longer, and then it ends up into being a disruption. They often also get set up by other children they might be playing a practical joke. They'll target that child to play the practical joke, and they'll be the one that ends up into trouble. They're not discerning, and they can't actually see, who's having them on, and they also don't see the consequences for actions. So they do things without thinking, really. Occasionally, this will be a child who tends to feel that life is unfair. They carry a big chip on their shoulder, and they refuse to try. Fortunately, there's not too many children that have this, but occasionally when you get one, it's actually quite hard to beat. It's basically like they've kind of given up. They actually don't believe that they can be supported and that people will help them, and that they have a chip on their shoulder about it. And finally, this is the child who can understand the Odyssey of Homer, but they can't read in or if. So, how can it be that a child can be this intelligent but then have trouble with simple words, reading two-letter words and spelling three-letter words? So it's a real anomaly. Now, with these characteristics, what we look at is a cluster of characteristics. So, for example, if I look down that list, I can pick out one or two things that I may have a problem with. For example, I can tell you that I have a problem with spatial awareness, and I have trouble, if you like, in a really odd thing. I can never decide the right bowl to put the leftovers in, and the bowl I choose is always too small or too big, and I end up with lots of dishes. Now, there's no terrible consequences to that problem, but I do have a spatial awareness problem. Fortunately, I can park a car, because if I couldn't park a car, that might be a bit more threatening for all of you. But I only have one or two of those difficulties, so you wouldn't say that I have a learning difficulty. But what we're looking for is a cluster, and if you look down the list, you will see that children in your class have a number of characteristics. Now, what I suggest you do, if you suspect that a child fits this category, down on the website we will have the list of 25 things. I suggest you print that off and you actually tick off the characteristics that you think a child has. Now, what you're looking for is 6 characteristics or more before you would suspect that a child has a learning difficulty. And to be fair, even if you have a moderate learning difficulty, you will actually have most of those things. If you've only got 6, it's actually only quite a mild difficulty. Now, at this point, I also suggest that you turn off the DVD in your staff rooms and you actually take a piece of paper and you write a list of the children that you think that you'd like to take a closer look at from watching this DVD so far. And so again, in your class, you'll have those children that are already diagnosed, and now you're looking at children that you'd like to take a closer look at as a result of the new learning that you have. So I suggest you do that now. Okay, welcome back. What I want to do now is I want to look at understanding third wave learners. What is the difference between third wave learners and second wave learners? Now, traditionally, in mainstream education, what we have done is that if we find that a child has a particular difficulty in reading, writing or spelling, we actually give them some form of reading, writing or spelling program to bring up their skills. We might have a specialist teacher who works with them, or we might have a program that we actually put them on, but it's basically academically based in the area that they're having difficulty. Now, what we say is that children in the third wave category actually have underpinning cognitive weaknesses. They have particular problems that prevent them from being able to access the academic program. And so what we need to do is we need to address those academic weaknesses and deal with those things, and then the child will go on to success in reading, writing, spelling and other academic areas. So the thing I want to do next is I want you to help you understand what those cognitive weaknesses are. Firstly, auditory weaknesses. Most children who have a specific learning difficulty have either an auditory or a visual weakness, and sometimes people have both. Now, this one is actually quite tricky because a lot of people get their ears tested, they get their eyes tested, and we're told that they hear and see well. But there can be an auditory or a visual processing problem, which is although that the eyes and the ears see and hear perfectly well, they don't process what they see. So the brain isn't interpreting what's heard and what's seen well. So you can have these underpinning weaknesses in terms of things like auditory discrimination, which is a difficulty hearing the difference between sounds. You can have auditory sequencing, which is an inability to sequence the syllables and words correctly. You can have difficulty with memory, memory for things seen, and even sequential memory. Figure ground, which is also the ability to attend to the important sounds. Now, if you're in a busy classroom setting, for example, and there's a group of children doing an activity in the corner, you can hear the lawnmower going outside, there's a phone ringing in the next door office, there's somebody else talking and having a conversation, and you're trying to listen to the teacher. It's very hard for some children to attend to the important information and be able to screen out all the other things that are going on, and for some children that can be so difficult it becomes a learning difficulty. Another one is auditory closure, being able to complete the sentences, words from things heard. Now, all of those weaknesses can occur in a visual area as well. Visual discrimination, visual sequencing, visual memory, visual figure ground, and visual closure. And for some children who have both, that's particularly difficult. Now, if you have an auditory difficulty, we can use your visual strength to help you build your auditory, and vice versa. But if you have both an auditory and a visual difficulty, then it makes it harder for learning. We have to work on a lot on kinesthetic senses. So those are two underpinning cognitive weaknesses. Now, 99.9% of children with a learning difficulty also have a phonological weakness, and that is that they don't have good understanding of letter sounds and letter sound patterns, which affects their reading, writing and spelling. And this has been one of the areas that has been widely focused on as the key thing for dyslexia, especially in a mainstream setting. And although it is very important and we actually have to address this, it is also very important that we recognise the other areas, because sometimes I think we can oversimplify dyslexia and look at it as a reading writing problem, and if we fix the phonological difficulties then we fix dyslexia, but it's not as simple as that. But interestingly enough, if we go back to our first wave, second wave and third wave learners, we will find that first wave learners do not need phonics. First wave learners have phonetics and phonological awareness almost inherent in their bones. They just have this really good awareness of letter sounds. Second wave learners need a bit of specific phonological teaching, but if they have a good mainstream program where they have whole language teaching, phonological teaching, just throughout the program, they will learn to read and write quite well with a small amount. Third wave children, if they do not get specific phonological awareness teaching and training, they simply do not learn to read. And so for us as educators, it's knowing about our learner groups and the needs of those learner groups and providing what they need. So underpinning cognitive weakness, phonological awareness. Another weakness is gross and fine motor skills. Now, some children can have major gross motor skill problems, which make sort of things like coordination and sports and even sort of movements difficult. Other children can have fine motor skill problems, which makes things like handwriting, cutting, sticking, gluing, all those kind of things really difficult to do, and as they go on without improving their handwriting, then it affects handwriting speed and legibility and all those things. So it's important that we address those difficulties. Also, processing speed. Many of the children with learning difficulties have slower processing, and so this is where we actually need to give them extra time to complete things and also work on building up that processing speed, their ability to complete tasks more quickly at speed. Another underpinning cognitive weakness is short-term and working memory, and in order to be an effective learner you actually have to have a good short-term memory, being able to hold things in your memory, and a lot of things like maths and language require a good working memory, and if you have a poor working memory it really affects your learning. So what we're really saying here is that as educators we need to have an understanding of the cognitive weaknesses, and then we actually have to make sure that we address those needs in our learners. Now, it's very interesting because we're looking now, there's a lot more research that has become available over the last 5 and 10 years about the brain and how we learn and what's happening. And we know now that if you have a specific learning difference, that people, for example, with dyslexia, their brains do function differently. For example, they have an overactive frontal lobe and an overactive occipital lobe if you have dyslexia, and that you don't use the language centres of the brain for processing in the same way. So that means that you can actually have processing delays, and you can have some of these other underpinning weaknesses that we've talked about. And similarly, if you have ADHD, we know that children with ADHD have underdeveloped frontal lobes, and we know that the place in our brain where we do planning and common sense and looking at what's right and wrong is in our frontal lobes. So it's easy to see why children may have difficulties with impulsive behaviour and behaviour type problems with ADHD, given that knowledge. Now, one of the people who is becoming very renowned in the world for neuroscience, well, for understanding this learning, is Barbara Arrowsmith-Young. And Barbara is a Canadian specialist, and she talks about, she's recognised now as the creator of one of the first programs based on neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is important because we now know that we can change the ability of the brain and the way that the brain functions. So neuroscience can tell us what area of the brain and networks are critically involved in sort of certain aspects of behaviour and learning. It can actually tell us about the abnormal development. It can tell us what regions are not functioning normally and what areas could benefit from intervention. And knowing this means that we can create programs to stimulate and strengthen the different areas of the brain using neuroplasticity. So for those of you that aren't really familiar with the term neuroplasticity, it is the brain's ability to change structurally and functionally in response to stimulation. We can grow new dendrites in the brain and make neural connections. So this is what we're trying to do through our learning, is get the child to grow new dendrites and make new neural connections so that the brain can improve its capacity to learn and function. But the interesting thing is, with neuroplasticity, it can actually lead to both positive and negative changes. So we need to understand how can we reduce the negative changes and how can we increase the positive changes. So Barbara actually talks about the principles needed to evoke change. And there are 5 key things that we actually need to do. And I want to do an example. So let's imagine that we've got a child who has difficulty hearing the difference between letter sounds. Now, if you're listening to this from another country, you might think that my letter sounds, the way that I speak because of my accent, is quite difficult to hear those differences in sounds. So if you can imagine that we're working with someone who has trouble hearing the difference, say for example, between the eh as in apple, eh as in egg, as in igloo, oh as in orange, and as in umbrella. So first thing we have to do, if we're looking at Barbara Arrowsmith's principles, we have to design a task that places demands on a specific cognitive function. So we're going to assume that this learner here, that I'm pretending I've got beside me, has difficulty with short vowel sounds, and they have difficulty hearing the differences between those. So that's the task we're going to work on. Now we have to start the difficulty level that is just above the current level and increase the difficulty incrementally. So for example, let's say we've got this new learner and they have trouble with all the vowel sounds. We've done an assessment test and they have trouble hearing all the vowel sounds. So we're going to start on the eh and the ah sound, which is the one that they get confused. So we know their difficulty level, we're going to start there, and then we'll introduce later the I sound, the oh sound, and the eh sound. Then we actually have to remove any scaffolding or support that could compensate for the targeted weaker area of functioning. Now if you're looking at this and I'm actually saying oh and ah, you're actually getting some visual input from my mouth moving as to the sound. Now if I was going to remove any scaffolding or support, I would prevent you seeing my mouth. And so with a child, I will have the child seated next to me. so that they have to rely on their ears, they can't rely on seeing my mouth. So that's what removing the scaffolding means. Because normally, if we had a child in our class who had an auditory problem, we would seat that child in front of us. We would seat them close to the front and straight on so that they could actually use facial features, gestures, see the mouth moving to help them with their auditory learning. But if we're removing scaffolding so that we want them to just focus on their ears, then we take that away. The next thing is that we build in performance mastery criteria that is rewarded. We want to be able to maintain sustained attention. We actually want to have engagement with the student, and we also want to look at the reward effects on dopamine. And all that, the reward effects on dopamine is beyond the scope of this video, but I do want to just say that we will include that. And for example, with engagement, we will have a number of multisensory ways that we teach this, so that the children are engaged in the process, they give sustained attention, they want to be here, and that there are, we would design a good reward program. And the next thing is we need repeated and prolonged practice. And this piece of information may come as a real surprise to many educators. They actually say if it takes a child 7 times, a mainstream child 7 times to learn something, for children with specific learning differences or difficulties or disabilities, whichever you want to call it, it can be exponential. That means 49 times. And therein lies a huge problem for us as educators, because how can we set up a classroom that if the average child needs 7 times and yet there are a few children in the classroom who need 49 times, how can we cater for that? Now, these are some of the real issues that differentiated teaching and meeting the needs of at-risk learners brings up. Now, it's again outside the scope of this DVD, but one of the things that we do is that we have set up programs that can meet those needs, but it's the classroom's teacher's role to establish them, but not to do them. So, for example, if we have good first practice classroom teaching and the classroom teacher provides the 7 times in a multisensory way of the teaching, they've done their bit. We also have access to teacher aides, and what we can do is that we can train those teacher aides to work specifically in those areas to do repetition and overlearning, and they have put in some times. Now, many of these children will also have a specialist teacher who comes in and works with them, maybe once a week, maybe twice a week if they're lucky, and that specialist teacher will also put in repetition and overlearning. Finally, I also do a lot of work with parents, and I tell parents this information. And once parents realise that their child needs 49 times repetition and that the class teacher, teacher aides and specialist teachers cannot do this on their own, we actually train parents to do the repetition and the overlearning as well. So what we have done in effect, we have actually set up a system where we can provide the amount of repetition and overlearning that it's required, but we've actually done it through a team approach. If your school is interested in developing this further, please get in touch with me and I'll look forward to working with you on that. But back to Barbara Arrowsmith. So her 5th thing was repeated and prolonged practice. So what we've done is that we have set up a scenario where we can make neuroplastic change in a child's ability to learn through setting up a learning environment that does so. Barbara concludes that rather than change the way that we teach, what is needed is that we have to include cognitive programs as part of the curriculum so that students spend part of their day training their brain. So if we know, for example, that short-term and working memory is such an important part of learning and success in learning, then we need to train memory, working memory, in classrooms. And this is what Barbara is saying here. So rather than focusing on curriculum areas, we actually have to teach the underpinning cognitive weaknesses. Now, I was really lucky last year. I had the opportunity to attend the ACER conference in Melbourne, which was put on, it's a neuroscience conference, and both Barbara Arrowsmith was there, and I also listened to Martin Westwell. Martin's a strategic professor in the science of learning from Flinders University. Love that title, strategic professor in the science of learning. But he talked about when neuroscience meets the curriculum. He was talking about the Australian curriculum, but it could also be any other curriculum in the world. And he talked about there's a need for us to move from an industrial model of education to a post-industrial model of education. And if we look at how we've been teaching over the last years, we have focused very much on mainstream. We've actually had a one-size-fits-all. This is how education goes. Children attend school, they actually participate in that one-size-fits-all. It's been very linear, it's been very hierarchical, it's very content-based, subject orientated. We've also had pass rates. I mean, it's not that long ago where we actually said only 50% of the students can pass, and we actually scaled up the marks or scaled down the marks so that not everybody could pass. And it was also very student compliance focused. We teach, they learn, and it was very structured in that way. Martin talks about that we actually have to move to a post-industrial model of education. We have to focus on differentiated teaching, and that is where we actually look at the needs of individual learners and meeting those needs, addressing individual learning preferences. We also need to think about curriculum adaptations. So if we've got children in our classes who have differing levels of ability, how can we adapt our curriculum to meet those various needs? We've often been stressed in teaching about the amount of content that we actually have to teach in each year, and that we have to get through this. Which can have the effect of almost throwing knowledge at children. What this is actually saying is it's not what knowledge we've taught that matters, it's how effective that teaching has been. So it's what children have learned, not what we have taught, that really matters. And in order for that to be effective, we've actually got to think much more strategically about how we teach. What's the intent of what we're doing? What's the purpose? And we need to move to a more problem solving, more reasoning, looking at inference and making judgments about learning. I mean, we're told now that we don't even know the jobs that we're preparing our students for the future. And so we actually have to teach these higher level thinking skills in order to prepare them for a future world. So we need to move from that industrial model of education through to the post-industrial. And Martin also talks about the need to teach three skills. Firstly, we need to teach that stop and think. We need to get children to take control of their thoughts and their actions and their impulse inhibitions. So, the I want it now kind of approach. Secondly, he highlighted working memory. We know that working memory is a vital part to learning, so we've actually got to teach for it. And we also have to teach cognitive flexibility. We have to be able to switch gears, to adjust to changing demands and to priorities and perspectives. And so often in a situation, I think teaching is a great example. I mean, we get up and we go to school and we actually don't know what situation, what things that are going to come up in the classroom. We actually have to be spontaneous. We actually have to make adjustments. We may have planned an amazing lesson and then suddenly we realise that we've actually got too far ahead of the children and we need to refocus. So we need to be able to teach this cognitive flexibility to children if they're going to succeed. So I think it was a wonderful opportunity for me going to the ACER conference, which is the Australian Council of Education Research, to think about how our modern approach to teaching, how it's affecting children. And although I didn't go there specifically looking at the needs of at-risk student groups, both Barbara Arrowsmith and Martin Westwell, it was really music to my ears, because I thought if we're going to change the way that we teach from this industrial to the post-industrial, how beneficial that is going to be for the at-risk learner groups. Because when we look at the three things that Martin talks about teaching working memory, about teaching impulse inhibition, all those things are actually weaknesses of children with learning difficulties. And so by differentiating our teaching and changing, we're going to meet the needs of at-risk learner groups better. So I guess as teachers, what we want to know is how can we make changes to classroom practice that accommodates the needs of at-risk learners? So what does third wave learning and teaching look like? The first thing is that it's multisensory. And when we first heard about this term, sort of learning styles, everybody rushed out and went to find out about what their learning style was. Are they a kinesthetic learner, a visual learner, or an auditory learner? What we now know is it's not so much about what learning style you are, because often people are a mix of more than one, but multisensory is the key. People learn best when they have the opportunity to take in learning through all the senses. So as a teacher, we have to know how to create a visual program, how to create a kinesthetic program, and to include that in our teaching. And I think traditionally education has been known as a place for auditory learners, and if you're a good auditory learner, you will do well in education. So for many of us, and I was one of those as well, I had to learn how to keep it visual. I had to think, how can I put visual practices into my program? So I now use much more creative things like mind mapping, using colour. The brain likes colour, and it remembers things, and it stores things through colours. For some children, we need visual timetables. We need to use diagrams much more. Labelling of resources. We know that some children with slow processing and also have a rapid naming problem, that they can't find the word in their brain, it's on the tip of their tongue. So even labelling resources helps children with those difficulties. And we've often done it for a second language. If we're teaching Māori, or if we're teaching any second language, we will often label things in the classroom in that language, but what we're suggesting is that we actually label things in English as well. And a second area is actually the use of highlighters. And, you know, I mean, when I went to school, I mean, nobody actually taught us how to use highlighters, and I think they weren't around when I was actually, you know, learning at a high school level, for example. But we have to use and to teach highlighters. Again, the brain focuses on colour, but it also teaches keywords and it highlights important things. So all these tools are ways that we can teach more visually. And what I have found now is when I'm doing my lesson planning, the question I actually ask myself is, what have I got in here that is multisensory? Am I catering for visual, auditory and kinesthetic learners, and have I included all styles in my planning? So we've established that third wave learning needs to be multisensory. It also needs to be structured and sequential. Now, a lot of people would actually say that school is structured and school is sequential, and I would agree, but not enough for children of third wave learners. And I very much feel this way even regarding social programs. We teach social skills in schools and we teach social programs, but we actually just teach it on a cursory level. Many of the social problems that children with learning difficulties have, we wouldn't even think to teach in a social skills program because they're often skills that are picked up automatically. And it's the same with the structure. We think that when we plan a lesson that we've actually teaching it in a structured way, we've planned it sequentially, but in actual fact we need to know very clearly where the children are at in terms of their learning and what their next steps in learning are. Now, if we're a secondary school teacher, the chances are that we actually haven't been taught the developmental stages of learning. And if we are a primary school teacher, I would say that we've given this some attention, but we actually haven't given it enough. Now, for example, one of the programs that I use, and you will see this on the resource page on the website, is the Alpha to Omega program. The Alpha to Omega program is an integrated reading, writing and spelling program that is very multisensory, it is structured and it is sequential. And I want to explain what I mean by that. Now, at the beginning of the Alpha to Omega book, you will actually find that there is an assessment test. And this assessment test actually looks at what letter sound knowledge and letter pattern knowledge a child has in relation to reading, writing and spelling. Now, we can identify their gaps in learning, and we can also see the stage of learning they're up to and what's next. Now, for example, short vowels come first, then long vowels, then blends, then digraphs, then triple blends. And this is the order that children learn letter sound knowledge and letter patterns in. So by using this program, it's structured very clearly and it's sequential, and we can work out what next steps a child is at. Now, the beauty of the program, I find, the Alpha to Omega book actually teaches you the what, the how, the when, and the why. And it gives you the information that you can actually teach through. So we need children to progress in both reading, writing and spelling. And I have done another video that shows you about the Alpha to Omega program in action. So if you want more on this, you can go to that part on the website. The other thing that third wave learning and teaching does is that it's actually more brain compatible. And we've talked even throughout this DVD about some of the research that is now coming out about brain compatibility. And we need to make sure that we are teaching in ways that is brain compatible. And we now know that many of the things that we were taught in our training is outdated and actually even incorrect. So, for example, things like we know that the amygdala now in the brain is much more important in learning than what we first thought. And that is the emotional senses that children have to, their brains and they have to be in a ready state for learning. And so, for example, we used to come along to school and we used to say 9 o'clock was the great time for academic literacy, learning time. It was quality learning time, and we would get into the work at 9 o'clock. What we now know is that some of the children are actually coming to school. They've actually been perhaps in an emotionally vulnerable states. They may have not had breakfast. They may have not had good sleep, all those things. And we now have a number of schools who are actually taking for half an hour in the morning sessions that are supporting children, giving them breakfast, supporting them emotionally to get them in a ready state for learning. So this is how we're actually adapting our curriculum and our education system in a brain compatible way. Even what we talked about earlier regarding the multisensory, having that knowledge of visual, auditory and kinesthetic, and why it's important to work in a multisensory way. So we're including that in our teaching, and that's what third wave learning and teaching does. We've already discussed the repetition and overlearning, and we need to make arrangements for that repetition and overlearning. Our information needs to be based on diagnostic evidence. So the Alpha to Omega program, we've done our diagnostic assessment, and now we're using that information to teach the next steps. And finally, a third wave learning and teaching program teaches metacognitive strategies. And this is another area. First wave learners don't need teaching metacognitive strategies. First wave learners figure out very quickly the best way of doing things, finding the shortcuts, finding rules, finding methods, and they just do it with ease. Second wave learners need to be taught things like mind mapping, skimming and scanning, keywords, comprehension techniques, and given the normal 7 times practice and the teaching of those things, they will actually do quite well. Third wave learners don't pick up those things inherently. They need specific teaching of metacognitive strategies, when to use the strategy or what the strategies are, when to use it, and how to use it. And in fact, I worked with someone in one of the seminar sessions that I ran who said that they marked exam results, and they said that they could actually get a pile of exam papers. They could actually put them in two piles where they saw that a child had used mind mapping, highlighters, keywords that actually planned their exams. They put them in that pile, and the children who had no evidence of metacognitive strategies, no mind mapping, no planning, no highlighters, they put them in that pile, and without exception, this pile were the high achievers, this pile were the low achievers. And so one of the things that I say is that we need to teach metacognitive strategies to third wave learners. So we've talked a lot about best practice, and our goal is to make best practice common practice. So what are some of the things that we can do to achieve that? So firstly, we want to review learning at the beginning of each lesson. So often we actually talk about this repetition and overlearning, and by reviewing learning at the beginning of each lesson, we can actually make that as part of the repetition and overlearning. We also want to build on prior learning. What do the students already know about a particular topic, and what is their next steps, so that we're building incrementally on what they know. We want to use those multisensory approaches, and we also want to teach and use alternative strategies. We want to establish the purpose for the learning. My great colleague Mike Scadden, who looks at neuroscience and brain compatible learning, he says that we've got 8 seconds to establish the purpose, and if they can't see the reason for doing something in the first few minutes, then it won't sink in. So we actually have to establish and show what that purpose is. And we are getting better now. We have the waltz, we are learning too, and the key focus for the lessons, and doing those things are vitally important. We also want to state that learning intention. We want to teach, explain the metacognitive strategy. What are we doing, why are we doing it, and how are we doing it? And we also want to summarise the key points at the end of the lesson. So again, we get that repetition and overlearning. And I think the big question really is, are there any students who won't learn better this way? And if we focus on differentiating and changing the type of teaching, then we're going to meet the needs of all learner groups. We've come to the end of the introductory video. I hope that this has given you a lot of food for thought and some thinking around what you're doing in your classroom and how you can do things better. I've had a number of people who've come to me and said that they would really like me to work with their schools, but having come to one of my sessions, they understand what's next. This DVD is really a gift to schools to get them started thinking about the process and to help you meet the needs of the at-risk learner groups in your school, to look at differentiating teaching. I would welcome the opportunity of talking with schools further if they'd like to learn more about any of the concepts in the video. We do 2-hour workshop series for schools, half-day workshops, full-day workshops, and we actually also do a 2-year process where schools can embark on developing policy and practice to really meet the needs and make a difference for at-risk learner groups. I look forward to seeing you again. Goodbye.